Over 3,000 years ago, an unstoppable storm descended upon the lands surrounding the Mediterranean. Cities that had once flourished were reduced to smoldering ruins. Kingdoms once centers of art, commerce, and diplomacy vanished one by one, as if they had never existed at all. And in the fragmented records left behind by survivors, a chilling phrase appears again and again. Invaders from the sea. Who were they? The ancients called them the Sea Peoples, mysterious warriors, who appeared suddenly, sailing strange ships, wielding unfamiliar weapons, and speaking tongues no one could decipher. Their origin remains unknown, their purpose still debated, but their arrival shattered the ancient world like a hammer striking glass. To this day, their true identity remains one of the greatest puzzles of ancient history. Were they desperate migrants fleeing a collapsing homeland, ruthless pirates exploiting weakened borders, or a coordinated force determined to topple the existing world order? Nearly every clue we have comes from those who stood in their paths that chronicled the terror, not the invaders themselves. It's as if history conspired to erase them. But in ruins and records, shipwrecks and tablets, whispers still echo. Tonight, we follow that trail. The trail of nameless fleets and forgotten battles, of ancient fires and crumbling walls. This is the story of the Sea Peoples and the twilight of a once glorious age. To understand why their arrival sent shockwaves across the ancient world, we must first look back at what the Mediterranean was before the fall. It was not a land of isolated kingdoms, but a deeply connected world, a mosaic of thriving civilizations bound by trade, diplomacy, and shared innovation. Between the 14th and early 13th centuries BCE, this region entered a golden age of prosperity. Civilizations flourished economically, technologically, and culturally. But beneath the surface, this interconnected system was as fragile as it was magnificent. In the south, Egypt's new kingdom stood at its zenith. Under powerful pharaohs like Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Seti I, vast temples rose along the Nile, monuments to divine rule and imperial ambition. Egyptian ships sailed far and wide, returning with cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and exotic spices from the fabled land of Punt. Northward, across the Anatolian plateau, the Hittite Empire dominated from its fortified capital at Hattusa. These were not mere conquerors, but skilled diplomats. Their clay archives contain some of the earliest examples of complex international treaties, revealing a world of negotiation, balance, and uneasy peace. To the west, the Mycenaean civilization ruled over the Greek mainland. From mighty centers, like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, they projected power through military might and trade. Their ships sailed across the Mediterranean, loaded with wine, olive oil, fine pottery, and finely crafted bronze weapons. Eastward, the cities of the Levant Ugarit, Byblus and Sidon served as vital ports in this economic web. Ugarit, especially, was a beacon of culture and commerce. It was here that the world's first true alphabet was developed, foundation upon which many modern writing systems would later be built. South of these ports lay the land of Canaan, a territory rich in promise and closely tied to the ambitions of neighboring empires. Its people contributed to coastal trade, offering goods that sustained the larger economic engine of the region. What linked these cities, empires, and peoples was not only power or wealth, it was a complex network of trade. Vast sea routes and overland caravans carried vital materials across continents. Bronze, the metal that shaped the era, required both copper and tin resources often sourced from distant lands. Shipwrecks like the Aluburan, discovered off modern-day Turkey, reveal astonishing cargo: glass ingots, ivory, gold jewelry, and raw metals, evidence of a globalized world centuries before that word existed. But this intricate interdependence was also its Achilles heel. When a single link broke, whether through war, famine, or natural disaster, the entire system could spiral into collapse. Centralized governments, despite their grandeur, were often brittle and slow to adapt. They were ill-prepared for a crisis that struck from the sea without warning and without mercy. No one could have foreseen it. Within a few short decades, this flourishing world would unravel. From the Aegean to the Levant, cities burned, palaces fell, and once mighty kingdoms were swept into the abyss. At the center of this upheaval was a force unlike any seen before, mapped, unnamed, and unstoppable. The Sea Peoples had arrived, a network vast, invisible, and vital, stretched across the ancient world, binding the fate of every civilization. In the region, it was more than commerce. It was the system upon which life itself depended. Imagine, for a moment, a ship setting sail from the bustling port of Ugarit on a clear Mediterranean morning. On its deck lie heavy barrels of precious cargo, gleaming copper, freshly mined from the rich seams of Cyprus, a land renowned for its unmatched deposits. Alongside the copper rest rare ingots of tin, far harder to find, possibly transported from the highlands of Anatolia, the distant Caucasus, or even the wind-swept mines of the British Isles. These metals did not travel alone. They bore the fingerprints of perilous journeys, passing through dozens of hands and hostile territories before arriving at the coast. Together, copper and tin formed bronze, the alloy that defined an age. It was not just a material. It was the strategic lifeblood of an entire era. With bronze came weapons, armor, plows, chisels, and intricate jewelry. Without it, armies weakened, construction halted, and economies began to crumble. The survival of kingdoms rested not only on soldiers or scribes, but on the steady flow of these two essential elements. Yet the cargo aboard the Ugaritic vessel carried more than just metal. Cedar logs, harvested from the ancient forests of Lebanon, were bound for shipyards and royal palaces. Nubian gold shimmered beside gemstones from Sinai, while aromatic resins from Arabia infused the hull with their fragrance. Even delicate jars containing the coveted purple dye squeezed from sea snails and reserved for royalty found space aboard. Every item told a story of need and exchange. From Egypt to Anatolia, from Mycenaean Greece to the shores of the Levant, trade routes stitched together empires, economies, and cultures. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, merchants traded textiles and early iron goods in return for horses and foreign metals. In Mycenae, royal tombs yielded artifacts from as far away as Egypt and Cyprus, a silent testament to an interconnected world. Ugarit itself was more than a port. It was a cultural nerve center where ideas, goods, and languages flowed freely. Trade did not merely sustain these societies, shaped them. And with trade came transformation. Metallurgical techniques spread from one coast to another. Religious beliefs and oral myths crossed borders with the same ease as amphorae of oil. Early alphabets, like that of Ugarit, formed the foundation for future scripts. These ships and caravans carried more than commodities. They carried civilization. But such deep entanglement came at a cost. With resources scattered unevenly across the region, no single kingdom could remain self-sufficient. The very strength of the Bronze Age willed its interdependence. was also its greatest vulnerability. Tin, rare and remote, was the weak link. A disruption in the supply chain, whether by piracy, drought, or war, could unravel the entire system. And in an age without backup resources, such a break could mean collapse. Diplomatic correspondence, carved into clay from El Amarna and Ugarit, reveals the tightrope of cooperation. Pharaohs sent artisans and gold to Hittite kings. Horses, metals, and even royal daughters were exchanged to cement alliances. These were not mere gestures, they were lifelines. Every letter, every gift, every pact was part of a delicate effort to keep the wheels of commerce and diplomacy turning. Scholars today view the Bronze Age as an early example of globalization. Like our modern systems, it thrived on balance and mutual benefit, but it was terrifyingly fragile. When harmony faltered, there was no cushion. A single fracture in the chain could set off a cascade of failures. And fracture it did. What the kings could not predict, what even their most trusted advisors failed to grasp, was that forces beyond human reach were already gathering. Climate shifts, droughts, seismic events, these natural tremors would become full-blown catastrophes. Crops failed, populations grew restless, and the intricate, shimmering web that had connected the known world began to fray. The Bronze Age world, once held together by ships, metals, and shared ambition, stood unknowingly on the brink. A crisis, centuries in the making, was about to begin, not with an explosion, but with a slow, silent unraveling. And when it came, it would not be merciful. Modern climate research, drawing from ancient ice cores, tree ring studies, and lakebed sediment analysis, has revealed a striking truth. In the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East experienced a prolonged period of intense climate instability. Droughts swept across the region with ruthless consistency, devastating crop yields in agricultural heartlands like Canaan, the Levant, and parts of Upper Egypt. Tree rings from Anatolia show years of stunted growth, a silent record of parched soil and withered harvests. Sediment core extracted from lakes in the Levant tell the same story. Rainfall patterns collapsed. Inscriptions and texts from the time echoed this evidence, chronicling rising unrest as food scarcity turned daily survival into a crisis. These societies, built on agricultural surpluses and sustained by seaborne trade in grain and essential goods, were suddenly gripped by a tightening noose. As food supplies dwindled, prices soared. Hunger spread beyond the farms into cities, palaces, and even royal courts. The very provinces that once provided soldiers and laborers for the mighty kingdoms were now unable to feed themselves. But the unraveling did not stop at the sky. The earth itself turned hostile. Powerful earthquakes, confirmed by geological fault line shifts and the sudden collapses observed at archaeological sites, struck cities with terrifying force. Places like Ugarit, Hattusa, and Mycenae exhibit destruction not from battle but from seismic violence. Stone walls splintered, granaries crushed, and temples reduced to rubble. These weren't isolated tremors, they were part of a pattern that coincided eerily with the broader breakdown of the late Bronze Age world. In a time when a king's legitimacy was tied to his ability to shield his people from both war and nature's fury, these natural catastrophes inflicted not only physical damage but also psychological devastation. The collapse of temples and palaces was more than structural, it was symbolic. It spoke of a cosmic order faltering, of divine favor seemingly withdrawn. Yet perhaps the most haunting testimony to this unraveling comes not from the ruins but from what was written down. In the ancient city of Ugarit, once a flourishing port on the Levantine coast and a key node in the region's vast trade web, archaeologists uncovered more than 1,000 clay tablets. These inscribed records detail the diplomatic and commercial lifeblood of a sophisticated urban center. Among these are letters, raw, desperate, human, that capture the panic of the final days. One such letter, sent by the king of Ugarit to the ruler of Cyprus, reads, "The enemy is at the gates. My city is in dire straits. Send reinforcements and food at once. If not, I fear Ugarit will not survive." Simple, urgent words, but they carry the weight of a collapsing world. A city once defined by luxury, ceremony, and trade, reduced to begging for survival. Other letters document the breakdown of the trade networks that had once ensured stability across the eastern Mediterranean. In one plea to the king of Alasia, Cyprus, the king of Ugarit laments that merchant ships can no longer reach the city's harbors. Pirates, mysterious and sudden in their appearance, now prowl the coast. Copper and tin shipments, once routine, have vanished. The arteries of commerce were clotting, and with them, the lifeblood of empires. What is particularly striking is the change in tone preserved in these tablets. In earlier correspondences, kings exchanged greetings, arranged royal marriages, and negotiated trade agreements with confident formality. But in the final tablets of Ugarit, that royal confidence is gone. Panic replaces diplomacy. Ceremonial language gives way to pleading. The proud are humbled. Kings, once symbols of divine order and strength, write with the fear and desperation of any common man. And then silence. Ugarit fell. When archaeologists excavated the ruins, many of these final letters were still on the writing tables, never dispatched. Clay tablets left behind, in a hurry abandoned, not with ceremony, but in terror. Their words frozen mid-plea, they remain among the most vivid relics of a dying world. It was precisely in this climate where crops failed, cities crumbled, and royal authority waned that the mysterious sea peoples appeared. Whether they were invaders exploiting chaos or the inevitable product of a world in collapse remains a question still debated. But what cannot be denied is that their arrival coincided with the death throes of a once interconnected Bronze Age civilization. Perhaps the clearest picture of that era's final moments is not found in toppled walls or buried temples, but in the trembling impressions left on clay by hands that knew their world was ending. Letters of desperation, carved in haste, never-read echoes of an age undone not only by war, but by hunger, nature, and fear. It was a rare moment in human history, a time of confidence, abundance, and cultural brilliance. The city of Ugarit, perched along the Syrian coast, stood as more than just a bustling seaport. It was a thriving center of art, language, and commerce. In the grand residences of wealthy merchants and nobles, gold jewelry, silver goblets, delicately painted pottery, and intricately carved figurines adorned every corner. Objects, not merely for use, but for admiration. These treasures told the story of a people who cherished beauty and spared no cost in surrounding themselves with it. Merchant ships arrived and departed from Ugarit's harbor in a rhythmic flow, their sails heavy with silk from the east, spices from Arabia, vibrant glassware, and rare metals from distant lands. In its crowded markets, the hum of multiple languages echoed as traders bartered for luxury goods. Across the city's walls, gifted artisans painted gods, mythic creatures, and scenes from ancient tales, each brushstroke reflecting a vibrant culture filled with pride and purpose. Far to the north, the Hittite capital of Hattusa stood no less regal. Towering stone gates and colossal temples lined its streets, their surfaces carved with intricate reliefs depicting deities and kings. Inside the palaces, scribes meticulously inscribed treaties and official records onto clay tablets, capturing the empire's triumphs and alliances with the quiet confidence of rulers who believed their names would echo through eternity. To the west, the Mycenaean city-states of the Greek mainland projected their wealth and power through monumental architecture. Grand palaces in cities like Mycenae and Pylos gleamed with color walls adorned with vivid frescoes, depicting ritual processions, hunting scenes, and daring naval expeditions. Bronze-clad warriors marched proudly in festivals celebrating strength, heritage, and the unbroken lineage of kings. Even the common folk, though far removed from palace life, benefited from this interconnected and flourishing world. They wore finer garments, owned better tools, and enjoyed access to items once reserved for royalty. In temples across the region, priests performed sacred rites with reverence and precision, offering lavish tributes to the gods' gestures, not just of faith, but of civic pride. These rituals affirmed a worldview that seemed unshakable, that kings ruled by divine favor, that trade would never falter, and that civilization would endure, season after season, generation after generation. There was, above all, an enduring belief in the permanence of their world. Victories were immortalized in stone. Treaties were carved for the ages. Merchants funded voyages across distant seas, trusting that the old paths would remain open. Festivals rang with music and laughter, temples glowed with firelight, and life moved forward under the illusion of eternal stability. But that illusion was fragile. Within a few short years, that glowing world would fall into darkness. Mighty fortresses would be consumed by flame. Temples would lie abandoned. Trade networks, once lifelines of prosperity, would snap like frayed rope. The joyous sounds of festivals would be replaced by cries of panic and grief echoing through empty streets. When we now read the last desperate letters from Ugarit, or when we walk among the ruins of Hattusa and Mycenae, we witness more than just the remnants of stone. We feel the haunting silence of a world that once overflowed with confidence and life, now reduced to scattered shards and buried dreams. Amid this brilliance, the first tremors of collapse emerged not through sudden war, but through quiet warnings etched in stone. The earliest known record of the Sea Peoples comes from a monument known as the Merneptah Stele, erected around 1207 BCE in Egypt. At that time, Pharaoh Merneptah, son of the great Ramesses II, faced mounting threats across Egypt's borders. In a proclamation of military triumph, Merneptah lists his enemies, the Libu and Meshwesh tribes to the west, but then adds something new, a subtle yet deeply significant passage. Canaan has been plundered, Ashkelon is taken, Gaza is captured, Yanom is annihilated, Israel is Ladwasti, its seed is no more, and the Shurdan, Shekelesh, Aquesh, Luka, and Tereshtos, who came from the sea, have been defeated, no longer a threat to Egypt. These names, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Luka, and Tereshwood, become the first direct references to the mysterious invaders from the sea. What stands out is the phrase "those who came from the sea." It's a description that is both precise and enigmatic, one that had never appeared in earlier Egyptian texts. These were not local foes. They were outsiders, unknown and uninvited. Modern scholars have debated their identity for centuries. Some believe they were displaced peoples fleeing collapsing societies. Others suspect they were organized coalitions of warriors, perhaps former mercenaries, now turned raiders united by necessity, hunger, or ambition. What's clear is this: these were not minor incursions. The fact that Pharaoh Meneptah included them in a royal monument meant their threat was real, their impact undeniable. Even more revealing is that their mention comes alongside the destruction of major Canaanite cities. This was not an isolated battle. These airborne forces were already reshaping the political and economic map of the Mediterranean. They were striking far beyond Egypt, through the very arteries that had once nourished a connected world. From this brief but powerful inscription, we glimpse the first ripples of a gathering storm. The sea peoples had emerged, yet fully understood, not yet fully feared, but already causing chaos across a fragile and overextended world. And this was only the beginning. In the years that followed, they would not limit themselves to raiding. They would come in migrations, toppling empires, and plunging an entire age into darkness. They did not come merely to raid. They came in waves. Entire migratory forces formed from displaced peoples, driven by crisis and hunger, bringing with them not only warriors but also families, women, children, and all their possessions. These were not pirates, they were civilizations. In motion, and wherever they landed, they reshaped the political and economic fabric of the region, marking the beginning of a century of upheaval that would redefine the ancient world. The Mukhtar stele recorded the first tremors of this seismic movement, a warning carved in stone, echoing through time. A once confident world was standing unknowingly on the brink of collapse, and less than 30 years later, the storm broke upon Egypt with full fury. It was around 1175 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, that Egypt faced one of its most defining and desperate battles. We know this moment not only through ancient texts, but also through the haunting relief carved into the walls of the mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in Thebes. These images, over 3,000 years old, remain stunningly preserved, clear, vivid, and brutally honest. They reveal what few ancient sources dare to show: an invasion not by mere raiders, but by whole nations on the move. Armies crossed the seas, but they were not alone. They came with ox-drawn wagons, livestock, children in tow, and wagons loaded with household goods. This was no hit-and-run raid. It was the desperate relocation of entire peoples, and they came to stay. According to the inscriptions left by Ramesses III, the coalition of invading groups included the Peliset, Jekka, Shekelesh, Denayan, and Weshesh names that still stir scholarly debate today. Who were they? Where did they come from? Their origins remain elusive, but their impact was undeniable. The Medinet Habu reliefs depict fleets of large, seaworthy ships with broad sails and banks of oars. Their warriors wore horned or conical helmets, carried round shields, and wielded strange foreign weapons. This was not a ragtag force. They were a highly organized confederation prepared for large-scale war. Ramesses III had seen them coming. He laid his defenses carefully, stationing ambush forces along the coastlines and positioning warships at strategic points in the Nile Delta. These river mouths were natural choke points, gateways to Egypt's heartland. And when the sea peoples attempted to pass through, they were met with a deadly trap. In the shallow waters, their ships became vulnerable. Egyptian archers rained down arrows from both shores while infantry closed in. The reliefs show the chaos of the battle-burning ships, warriors falling into the water, corpses floating in the Nile, and prisoners taken in chains. In the inscription, Ramesses III declared total victory. Those who came from the sea hurled them back into the sea. They lie scattered upon the sands. None remained to carry word home. But beneath this confident proclamation lies a harsher truth. This was not simply a repelled invasion. It was a massive, desperate migration, born of collapse elsewhere. And though Egypt survived, it did not escape untouched. The Egyptian hold over the Levant, a network of vassal states and military outposts, was shattered. These lands, once under Egyptian influence, were lost forever. Egypt's international power was diminished, and its economy weakened. The Sea Peoples may have been turned back at the Nile, but they succeeded elsewhere. Because beyond Egypt, the tidal wave continued. The Sea Peoples spread across the eastern Mediterranean like wildfire. Cities were torched, palaces fell. Entire civilizations, Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, Ugarit vanished from history in the span of a generation. The Medinet reliefs do more than illustrate a single battle. They capture the twilight of the Bronze Age, a moment when the old world order teetered and broke. What rose in its place was something more chaotic, fragmented, and uncertain. From other surviving sources such as the Menptah, Stele, and later diplomatic archives, we piece together a grim and fragmentary picture of these mysterious invaders. Scholars have identified several names frequently associated with the sea. Peoples, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Peliset, Jekka, Denayan, and Lucca, names that seem both familiar and foreign, haunting in their ambiguity. And most curiously, we have no surviving text written by the Sea Peoples themselves. Everything we know about them comes from the records of those who tried to stop them. Take the Shurdan, often depicted as elite warriors with horned helmets, scale armor, and finely made round shields. Some researchers see links to Sardinia, citing similarities in ancient weaponry and burial styles. But no conclusive evidence confirms their origin. The Shekelesh, perhaps tied to Sicily, again present, a tantalizing linguistic resemblance. But the archaeological silence remains deafening. The Peliset, however, leave a clearer trail. Most historians agree they were the ancestors of the Philistines, who later established powerful city-states along the southern coast of Canaan, including Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. In these cities, archaeologists have uncovered material culture distinctly different from the native Canaanites. New pottery styles, unique architecture, and evidence of pork consumption, a clue pointing to foreign origin. This archaeological footprint, when paired with the Egyptian records, confirms a larger truth. The Sea Peoples did not vanish after their invasions. They settled, they rebuilt, they became part of the new world that rose after the Bronze Age fell. Their presence reshaped history not just through destruction, but through integration. They were both the agents of collapse and the founders of new societies. And so today, as we stand before the ancient walls of Medinet Habu, we don't just see stone, we see the turning of an age, the moment when the last breath of the Bronze Age was expelled, and the world took its first uncertain step into a darker, harsher future. What followed the collapse of the great Bronze Age cities was not silence but transformation. Into the void left by drought, famine, and fractured empires came new arrivals, people whose culture bore unfamiliar traits, whose origins remain cloaked in mystery. Archaeological evidence in the Levant, particularly around sites like Doraville's, the arrival of new communities, markedly distinct from the native Canaanite traditions. Among them, a group of scholars refer to as the Jekar. They left architectural and ceramic footprints, yet their original homeland is still unknown. no text nor ruin, and no tombstone arrival, where the Jekka came from before joining the surge of people known collectively as the Sea Peoples. Then there are the Danaan, arguably the most enigmatic of them all. Some researchers link their name to the Danawai, a term found in ancient Greek texts that refers to the Mycenaeans. If this connection is accurate, it suggests that among the Sea Peoples were displaced warriors or refugees from the Greek mainland, fleeing the collapse of their own palatial civilization. But this remains speculative, a hypothesis awaiting conclusive proof. Another group, the Lukka, is often associated with the region of Lycia, in southern Anatolia land known for its ships, sailors, and a long-standing tradition of piracy and coastal raiding. Egyptian inscriptions reference the Lukka as enemies and invaders, but whether they are the same as the Lydians or Lycian peoples of later historical periods remains unresolved. The fragments don't quite align. The puzzle is incomplete. And that, in essence, is the central mystery of the Sea Peoples. Names like Shurdan, Peliset, Shekelesh, and Denayan appear in Egyptian texts, but none of them correspond to a kingdom marked on any ancient map. No city ever claimed to be the Shurdan capital. No monument declares the homeland of the Denayan. Not a single native inscription from any of these groups has ever been found. They have no known language, no literature, and no declared origin. They arrive in history as a storm, violent, sudden, and strangely anonymous. Were they desperate migrants, scattered by famine and ecological disaster, drawn together by necessity? Or were they a coordinated confederation, united by shared goals of conquest and settlement? Historians are still divided. The lack of a clear origin of a single unifying homeland has only deepened the intrigue. It is precisely this ambiguity, this haunting absence of answers that lends the Sea Peoples their enduring mystique. They remain one of history's great unsolved riddles, a forbidden chapter at the heart of the ancient world. Yet while we may not know where they came from, we know precisely how they appeared to those who stood against them. The clearest images come from the reliefs carved on the massive walls of the Temple of Medinet Habu in Egypt. Built under Pharaoh Ramesses III, walk among its colonnades, and the past rises in stone. Battle scenes unfold in vivid detail. Egyptians clashing with alien warriors, men whose appearance was starkly different from the Libyans, Nubians, and Canaanites the Egyptians had fought for centuries. What stood out most was their headgear. Sea Peoples warriors are depicted wearing unique helmets, some wide-brimmed with tall, feathered crests, others fitted with two prominent forward-facing horns. These designs had no parallel in Egyptian military traditions. They weren't just protection, they were symbols, emblems of identity, of foreignness. Were they ceremonial, reserved for leaders, or did they represent a broader warrior culture shared across the various Sea Peoples factions? The debate continues. Their shields, too, set them apart, round, often convex, sometimes reinforced with a central metal bus, and ideal for deflecting blows in close combat. These were typical of Aegean and Anatolian warfare, but unfamiliar in the Nile Valley, where soldiers favored tall, rectangular shields for formation fighting. Their weaponry included short, double-edged swords, wide daggers, and spears designed for both throwing and melee. Of particular interest are depictions of leaf-shaped swords, weapons almost identical to those found in Mycenaean ruins, further suggesting cultural links between the Sea Peoples and collapsing Aegean civilizations. Their attire spoke of agility. Short, fringed kilts, bare legs, and light sandals. side deal for fast landings, shipboard fighting, or coastal raids. These were not heavy infantry, they were mobile, swift, and accustomed to the sea. They were born of the water, not the land. To the Egyptians, these warriors were unlike any foe they had faced before, foreign in dress, arms, and tactics. Their very appearance conveyed the unsettling truth that Egypt was no longer fighting neighboring tribes, but an entirely new force, one that moved across the sea in waves, destroying as they came but never leaving a trace of where they began. Even today, scholars compare the imagery of the Sea Peoples with archaeological finds from Sardinia, Sicily, Lycia, and Mycenaean Greece. The puzzle pieces are scattered across the Mediterranean basin. The horned helmets, the bronze-tipped spears, the round shields, the leaf-blade swords. Every clue offers a glimpse, but never the full picture. What is certain is this: the Sea Peoples were not a footnote in history. They were powerful enough to threaten Egypt, resilient enough to topple kingdoms, and numerous enough to force a fundamental reshaping of the political map. They were not mere raiders, they were agents of collapse. And yet the question lingers: who were they really? Pirates, migrants, mercenaries, displaced warriors, a vast confederation born of desperation and sea-swept ruin. It is a question that has haunted archaeologists and historians for over a century. And still, as we gaze upon the stone-carved battle scenes at Medinet Habu, or decipher the desperate letters from Ugarit, we are left with fragments of a lost storm, one that reshaped the world, yet left no trace of its origin. The Sea Peoples remain ghosts from the deep, silent, faceless, and unforgettable. The arrival of the Sea Peoples plunged the entire Mediterranean into chaos, sparking one of the most debated enigmas in ancient history. The first theory, long held by many scholars, suggests that they were pirates, ruthless raiders, exploiting the vulnerabilities of wealthy coastal cities. Egyptian records, describing sudden, fast-moving attacks from agile ships, support this idea. These raids came without warning, followed by swift withdrawal, hallmarks of maritime piracy. This interpretation is further strengthened by groups like the Luca, believed to be linked to the region of Lycia, an area long known for its fierce seafaring warriors and pirate activity. It's a plausible explanation until we look closer. Why then, in Egyptian reliefs, do we see more than armed men? Why are there women, children, oxen, livestock, and household goods? Why do we find depictions of ox-drawn wagons carrying tents and personal belongings? These were not the tools of raiders. They were the burdens of migrating communities. This evidence opens the door to a second, more complex theory, that the Sea Peoples were not simpler plunderers, but part of a massive, desperate wave of migration. Many modern scholars now support this view, suggesting their movement was driven by profound upheaval across the ancient world. Environmental collapse, prolonged droughts, famine, and devastating earthquakes all contributed to the unraveling of long-established societies. Trade networks faltered. Entire regions became unsustainable. In this context, people from destabilized areas, perhaps from Anatolia, the Aegean, or even farther west, may have been forced to abandon their homelands. With them came not just warriors, but families, elders, and livestock, the entire fabric of their communities. When such mass migrations met resistance from settled civilizations, violence became inevitable. Raids, battles, and sackings may have followed not as conquest, but as survival. And so, the Sea Peoples may not have been a single group at all, but a loose, shifting confederation. Some pirates, others migrants, some hardened mercenaries, others displaced farmers and craftsmen. This diversity, this lack of singular identities, precisely what makes them so elusive and so haunting. They don't fit neatly into any historical category. They were, perhaps, a human response to catastrophe, unstoppable tide of people searching for stability in a collapsing world. To understand them, we must abandon simplified explanations. We must piece together every fragment, a weathered relief, a ruined wall, a shattered tablet. For buried within these remnants is the story of a world that refused to give up its secrets easily. While debate over their origins and purpose continues, what cannot be denied is the scale of their destruction. And perhaps no site bears more vivid testimony to this than the city of Ugarit, once a jewel of the northern Levant in what is now modern-day Syria. Ugarit was one of the great commercial capitals of the late Bronze Age. From its harbors, merchant ships sailed across the Mediterranean, trading tin, copper, cedarwood, colored glass, purple-dyed fabrics, and luxury goods with Egypt, Cyprus, and the Aegean. But Ugarit was more than wealthy, it was sophisticated. It was here that the Ugaritic alphabet was born, one of the earliest alphabets ever created. Its development would influence the Phoenician script and eventually lay the foundations for Greek, Latin, and the writing systems that shape our world. Today, the royal palace of Ugarit was vast, and within its walls, scribes recorded everything: commercial transactions, foreign diplomacy, and royal edicts. Hundreds of clay tablets have been recovered, shedding light on the political landscape, economic structure, and global connections of the time. Ugarit was not a peripheral town. It was central to the Bronze Age's international system. But then, almost overnight, it disappeared. The last surviving letters from Ugarit, pleas for help, warnings of incoming enemies, tell a tale of mounting fear. These letters, believed to be addressed to allies and vassals, go unanswered. The invaders, widely believed to be the Sea Peoples, descended swiftly, and Ugarit was gone. Modern excavations at Ras Shamra, the site of ancient Ugarit, reveal a horrifying truth. A thick layer of ash covers the city. Walls are collapsed, burned bricks lie fused together by extreme heat, and precious tablets, some still wet from the kill, remain unfinished. The destruction was fast, violent, and total. Even more telling, Ugarit was never rebuilt. No new settlements arose in its place. No population returned to reclaim the ruins. The city, once a beacon of literacy, trade, and culture, vanished from history, abandoned forever. Archaeologists have found unfinished diplomatic letters still lying on writing tables, unspent. Others were only partially inscribed, cut short by the chaos of the assault. These silent details speak volumes. They tell us that Ugarit had no warning, no time to prepare, and no final act of resistance. It fell so quickly that the scribes couldn't even finish their work. With the fall of Ugarit, a critical node in the Mediterranean's trade network was severed. The web of commerce and diplomacy that had once connected dozens of kingdoms and empires began to unravel. One collapse led to another, like dominoes tumbling in the dust. Today, when we gaze upon the blackened stones and broken tablets of Ugarit, we feel more than the weight of archaeology. We feel the echo of a world that was prosperous, proud, and interconnected, and that, in the face of relentless change, vanished almost without a trace. And Ugarit was only one of many. The tide of the Sea Peoples was no passing storm, it was a relentless wave that surged across the Mediterranean, dismantling the old world one city at a time. If the fall of Ugarit had exposed the devastating power these migrants could unleash upon coastal trade centers. Then the story of Hattusa, the great heart of the Hittite Empire, and an even darker, more mysterious chapter. Hidden within the rugged Anatolian plateau, Hattusa once stood as the nerve center of one of the most formidable powers of the Late Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire, ruling over vast stretches from central Anatolia to the Levant, was not merely a regional force. It was Egypt's chief rival, bound by treaties, defined by war, and sustained by diplomacy. The city itself was a marvel of Bronze Age architecture, massive fortification walls spanning kilometers, ceremonial gates adorned with stone lions, and sprawling royal palaces that anchored the power of kings. Beneath its soil, archaeologists have uncovered over 30,000 clay tablets, one of the richest archives of the ancient world, documenting every corner of Hittite life, their laws, rituals, diplomacy, and the machinery of empire. But then, without warning, Hattusa fell silent. Around 1200 to 1190 BCE, the city was suddenly abandoned. Excavations reveal widespread destruction, fire-scarred walls, toppled structures, and layers of ash. Yet the most haunting aspect is the mystery that surrounds it. No Egyptian records mention a Sea People's assault on Hattusa. No definitive attackers are named, and yet the timing of its fall aligns uncannily with the crescendo of chaos sweeping the wider region. Scholars remain divided. Some propose that after the Sea Peoples ravaged coastal cities, they indirectly caused the collapse of inland powers. The Hittite Empire, already strained by years of drought, climate disruption, and mounting pressure from hostile mountain tribes, may have simply crumbled under the weight of compounding crises. But one cannot ignore the echoes of desperation found in the final letters from Hattusa's king's pleas for aid sent to allies and vassals, hauntingly similar to the last desperate correspondence from Ugarit. What is known is this: Hattusa was never rebuilt. The Hittite Empire, once a titan of the Bronze Age, vanished. In its place, the central highlands of Anatolia fractured into smaller, scattered kingdoms. A mighty empire erased. Did the Sea Peoples directly strike the capital? Or did their ripple effect, the destabilization of trade routes and diplomatic alliances, push an already vulnerable empire into free fall? The evidence is circumstantial, but the shadow of their impact hangs unmistakably over Hattusa's final days, and that shadow kept spreading. As Anatolia fell into silence, the wave of collapse swept westward across the Aegean Sea and crashed into the very heart of the Mycenaean world, the pinnacle of Bronze Age Greek civilization. The Mycenaeans were no backwater culture, with cities like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes. They stood as one of the dominant commercial and military powers of the Mediterranean. Their architecture was massive. Fortresses encircled by cyclopean stone walls, built as if by giants. Inside their royal tombs, archaeologists discovered gold masks, ceremonial weapons, and treasures traded from as far as Egypt and Anatolia, proof of wealth, power, and far-reaching diplomacy. At the heart of Mycenaean society stood the palace complexes. Each was ruled by a Wainaxa king, who oversaw everything from religious ceremonies to military campaigns, economic production to foreign affairs. Their economy was centralized, bureaucratic, and deeply dependent on long-distance trade networks. But by the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the cities began to fall one after another. At Mycenae, thick layers of ash and rubble reveal a violent city-wide fire. Granaries, armories, and residential quarters all burned together, pointing to a single, coordinated collapse. At Pylos, home to the legendary palace of Nestor, similar evidence emerges. In fact, one of the last administrative clay tablets preserved by the flames records orders to mobilize local defenses and prepare warships, suggesting that the city was still organizing its defense when the final blow came. Tyrannus, with its towering walls and military infrastructure, suffered the same fate: collapsed structures, widespread destruction, and no sign of recovery. Perhaps the most striking fact is this: none of these major centers were ever rebuilt. The entire Mycenaean palace systems, so central to the Greek world's political and economic fabric, collapsed entirely, and with it, the civilization unraveled. Some scholars have proposed internal causes: rebellion, economic stress, or dynastic power struggles. But when placed within the broader context, coinciding with the collapse of Ugarit, the abandonment of Hattusa, and the Sea People's onslaught against Egypt, many believe that external invasion or pressure, likely by the Sea Peoples themselves, played a significant role. And indeed, the few surviving records from Mycenaean sites mention defensive mobilizations, naval preparations that hint at a looming seaborne threat. Just as in Egypt, they had seen it coming. But unlike Egypt, they did not survive it. What followed was not recovery, but disappearance. The great cities fell quiet. The art, the writing, the trade all faded. Greece entered a dark age that would last for centuries. And with the collapse of Mycenaean Greece, yet another pillar of the Bronze Age world was swept into history. The tide of the Sea Peoples did not merely bring war, it brought transformation. From Syria to Anatolia, from Egypt to Greece, a 1,000-year-old order collapsed in less than 50 years. And the old world, the world of kings and scribes, of bronze and diplomacy, was gone. What followed the collapse of the great Bronze Age cities was not silence, but transformation. Into the void left by drought, famine, and fractured empires came new arrivals. People whose culture bore unfamiliar traits, whose origins remain cloaked in mystery. Archaeological evidence in the Levant, particularly around sites like Dora, reveals the arrival of new communities, markedly distinct from the native Canaanite traditions. Among them, a group of scholars referred to as the Jekka. They left architectural and ceramic footprints, yet their original homeland is still unknown. No text nor ruin, and no tombstone reveal where the Jekka came from before joining the surge of people known collectively as the Sea Peoples. Then there are the Danaan, arguably the most enigmatic of them all. Some researchers link their name to the Dana War, a term found in ancient Greek texts that refers to the Mycenaeans. If this connection is accurate, it suggests that among the Sea Peoples were displaced warriors or refugees from the Greek mainland, fleeing the collapse of their own palatial civilization. But this remains speculative, a hypothesis awaiting conclusive proof. Another group, the Lukar, is often associated with the region of Lycia in southern Anatolia land, known for its ships, sailors, and a long-standing tradition of piracy and coastal raiding. Egyptian inscriptions reference the Lukar as enemies and invaders, but whether they are the same as the Lydians or Lycian peoples of later historical periods remains unresolved. The fragments don't quite align. The puzzle is incomplete. And that, in essence, is the central mystery of the Sea Peoples. Names like Sherdon, Peleset, Shekelesh, and Danaan appear in Egyptian texts, but none of them correspond to a kingdom marked on any ancient map. No city ever claimed to be the Sherdon capital. No monument declares the homeland of the Danaan. Not a single native inscription from any of these groups has ever been found. They have no known language, no literature, and no declared origin. They arrive in history as a storm, violent, sudden, and strangely anonymous. Were they desperate migrants, scattered by famine and ecological disaster, drawn together by necessity? Or were they a coordinated confederation, united by shared goals of conquest and settlement? Historians are still divided. The lack of a clear origin, of a single unifying homeland, has only deepened the intrigue. It is precisely this ambiguity, haunting absence of answers, that lends the Sea Peoples their enduring mystique. They remain one of history's great unsolved riddles, a forbidden chapter at the heart of the ancient world. Yet while we may not know where they came from, we know precisely how they appeared to those who stood against them. The clearest images come from the reliefs carved on the massive walls of the Temple of Medinet Habu in Egypt. Built under Pharaoh Ramesses III, walk among its colonnades, and the past rises in stone. Battle scenes unfold in vivid detail. Egyptians clashing with alien warriors, men whose appearance was starkly different from the Libyans, Nubians, and Canaanites the Egyptians had fought for centuries. What stood out most was their headgear. Sea Peoples warriors are depicted wearing unique helmets, some wide-brimmed with tall feathered crests, others fitted with two prominent forward-facing horns. These designs had no parallel in Egyptian military traditions. They weren't just protection, they were symbols, emblems of identity, of foreignness. Were they ceremonial, reserved for leaders, or did they represent a broader warrior culture shared across the various Sea Peoples factions? The debate continues. Their shields, too, set them apart, round, often convex, sometimes reinforced with a central metal bus, and ideal for deflecting blows in close combat. These were typical of Aegean and Anatolian warfare, but unfamiliar in the Nile Valley, where soldiers favored tall, rectangular shields for formation fighting. Their weaponry included short, double-edged swords, wide daggers, and spears designed for both throwing and melee. Of particular interest are depictions of leaf-shaped swords, weapons almost identical to those found in Mycenaean ruins, further suggesting cultural links between the Sea Peoples and collapsing Aegean civilizations. Their attire spoke of agility. Short, fringed kilts, bare legs, and light sandals ideal for fast landings, shipboard fighting, or coastal raids. These were not heavy infantry, they were mobile, swift, and accustomed to the sea. They were born of the water, not the land. To the Egyptians, these warriors were unlike any foe they had faced before. Foreign in dress, arms, and tactics, their very appearance conveyed the unsettling truth that Egypt was no longer fighting neighboring tribes, but an entirely new force, one that moved across the sea in waves, destroying as they came, but never leaving a trace of where they began. Even today, scholars compare the imagery of the Sea Peoples with archaeological finds from Sardinia, Sicily, Lycia, and Mycenaean Greece. The puzzle pieces are scattered across the Mediterranean basin. The horned helmets, the bronze-tipped spears, the round shields, the leaf-blade swords. Every clue offers a glimpse, but never the full picture. What is certain is this: the Sea Peoples were not a footnote in history. They were powerful enough to threaten Egypt, resilient enough to topple kingdoms, and numerous enough to force a fundamental reshaping of the political map. They were not mere raiders, they were agents of collapse. And yet the question lingers: who were they really? Pirates, migrants, mercenaries, displaced warriors, a vast confederation born of desperation and sea-swept ruin. It is a question that has haunted archaeologists and historians for over a century. And still, as we gaze upon the stone-carved battle scenes at Medinat Habu, or decipher the desperate letters from Ugarit, we are left with fragments of a lost storm, one that reshaped the world, yet left no trace of its origin. The sea peoples remain ghosts from the deep, silent, faceless, and unforgettable at the Palace of Pylos, even as destruction loomed on the horizon. The final records show that city officials were still desperately trying to respond, organizing supply convoys, requesting military aid, and attempting to mobilize their naval fleet. But it was too late. The trade routes that once linked them to the broader world had unraveled. Their calls for help echoed into silence. From that moment, the ancient world spiraled from fragile order into irreversible chaos. International alliances, once bound by treaties carved into stone, treaties declared eternal, crumbled overnight. Diplomatic partners were either destroyed or too weakened to respond. The palace-based economy, which had depended on the constant inflow of foreign materials, metals, grain, luxury goods, collapsed. Without trade, the system that supported aristocracies, artisans, scribes, and laborers disintegrated. Palaces fell into ruin. Nobles lost their power. Artisans were left with idle hands. The broader population, stripped of protection and imported food, reverted to subsistence living. Roads that once bustled with commerce fell silent. Warehouses, once overflowing with foreign goods, stood hollow and abandoned. And along the seacoasts, once the lifeblood of Mediterranean exchange, the great docks, decayed weathered mooring posts, and broken stone platforms whispering of a world now gone. Many historians today describe this period not just as a collapse, but as one of the earliest examples of the failure of globalization. A deeply interconnected world built on trade, diplomatic trust, and cultural exchange was revealed to be astonishingly fragile when faced with widespread disruption. What appeared stable and eternal crumbled like sand under the weight of catastrophe. And when the dust finally settled, the Mediterranean world, as it had been known, vanished. In its place rose a fractured, localized, and uncertain order, centuries dark age from which it would take humanity generations to emerge. In the aftermath of this collapse, the question of the Sea People's origin has only grown more urgent. Among the most debated theories is that a segment of the Mycenaean population, following the fall of their palace-based civilization, became part of this wave, migrating and, at times, raiding across the Mediterranean. The theory is built on compelling evidence. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE, the Great Mycenaean Palace centers Mycenae, Pylos, and Tyrants fell in rapid succession. The aristocracy that governed them vanished. The administrative centers burned, and the steady flow of imported resources on which these city-states relied came to an abrupt halt. Faced with famine, insecurity, and political collapse, many Mycenaean communities were forced to abandon their cities. Archaeological surveys show steep population declines across the Peloponnesian plains and the abandonment of once thriving coastal settlements and Aegean islands. At the same time, new cultural layers began to appear in places like the Levantine coast layers that bore strong Aegean traits in pottery, architecture, and burial customs. One group among the Sea Peoples, the Danaian, may in fact be connected to the Danaia name used in later Greek tradition to refer to Mycenaean peoples. This linguistic connection, though not definitive, adds weight to the argument that some displaced Mycenaeans joined with other migrating groups, forming armed bands in search of new lands to settle by diplomacy or by conquest. Yet, the theory is far from conclusive. No direct evidence links the Sea Peoples who clashed with Egypt to the Greek language or to the specific political symbols of the Mycenaean kingdoms. In Egyptian reliefs, the Sea Peoples display a remarkable diversity. The Shurden wear horned helmets. The Peleset carry round shields and different weaponry. Clothing, armor, and fighting styles very significantly suggesting that the Sea Peoples were not a single ethnicity or culture, but a wide-ranging confederation of disparate groups. Moreover, archaeology in Greece shows that some Mycenaean communities survived after the crisis, particularly in more rural or isolated regions. If the entire warrior class had transformed into seaborne invaders, such cultural continuity would be harder to explain. Thus, while many scholars accept that displaced Mycenaeans may have played a role in the Sea People's story, they were likely only one piece in a much larger mosaic. The Sea Peoples were not a nation, they were a phenomenon, a convergence of collapse, migration, ambition, and survival. Reducing them to a single origin would oversimplify one of the most complex human movements of the ancient world. And that complexity is precisely what keeps their story alive. The Sea Peoples remain a haunting chapter in our shared history, a riddle scattered in ruins, ash, and stone. Another major theory, increasingly supported by archaeological and genetic studies, suggests that part of the Sea Peoples wave may have originated in the Balkans, particularly involving the Dorian tribes, who began migrating southward during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Evidence for this theory emerges from a convergence of patterns. Archaeological data from the Danube Valley and surrounding Balkan territories reveals widespread social upheaval in this period. Settlements were abandoned and fortifications destroyed. Scholars link this to possible climate shifts, overpopulation, or prolonged internal conflicts. Amid this turmoil, tribal groups began pushing southward, moving through Macedonia, Thessaly, and eventually into southern Greece. Among these were the Dorians, a people who would later reshape Greek civilization in the post-Mycenaean era. Their arrival, though recorded in later Greek legend as a return of the Heraclidae, may in fact represent a wave of southern migration, sparked by the same pressures that produced the Sea Peoples. Could it be, then, that the movements of the Dorians and the migrations of the Sea Peoples were part of the same regional collapse? Some scholars believe so. They argue that the pressures destabilizing the Balkans contributed not just to local migration, but to a massive, southward-moving wave of people that collided with the already fragile Mycenaean and Levantine world. Others suggest that some Balkan groups may have joined the broader Sea Peoples confederation, fighting not as invaders, but as desperate communities seeking refuge and land. Like so much in the story of the Sea Peoples, this theory is tantalizing but incomplete. Still, as we dig deeper into the ruins, as new inscriptions and genetic markers are uncovered, we may inch closer to an answer. Or perhaps the Sea Peoples were never meant to be one thing. Perhaps they were, in their essence, a symptom of a world pushed to its breaking point. What we know for certain is this: they changed history, and their shadow still lingers, later known in Greek tradition as the Dorians. These migrating peoples from the Balkans emerged at a time that eerily coincides with the collapse of the Mycenaean world. Their arrival in southern Greece during the early 12th century BCE has led scholars to pose a provocative question. Could a portion of the Dorians or other Balkan tribal groups have joined the Sea Peoples, helping to fuel a wave of armed migrations that surged across the Mediterranean? Archaeological evidence offers tantalizing hints. In the Peloponnese, post-collapse layers reveal abrupt changes in architecture, burial customs, and pottery styles, markers of a culture clearly distinct from earlier Mycenaean traditions. Similarly, along the Levantine coast, certain pottery types and building techniques appear that bear strong resemblances to those found in the Balkans and northern Greece. While not conclusive, these shifts suggest that new populations, perhaps from the north, were integrating into these regions. In the aftermath of the collapse, what's even more intriguing is that new scientific methods are adding weight to these hypotheses. Advances in ancient DNA research have opened a new window into this forgotten era. Genetic analyses of remains from Bronze and early Iron Age sites in Greece, the Balkans, and the Levant reveal notable shifts during the transition period. Preliminary findings indicate an increase in genetic markers associated with Balkan populations, appearing not only in Eastern Greece, but also in coastal Levantian communities. This suggests that some of these northern groups may not have stopped at Greece. They may have continued by sea, joining the larger migratory wave that we now call the Sea Peoples. Yet, as with all theories, caution is necessary. According to later Greek traditions, the Dorians did not vanish or assimilate into distant lands. Instead, they re-established dominance in post-collapse Greece. If large numbers of Dorians had joined the Sea Peoples, we might expect their later cultural footprint in Greece to be diminished, not reinforced. Furthermore, the Sea Peoples was never a singular force. Assigning a central role to the Dorians or any one ethnic group risks oversimplifying what was clearly a fragmented, diverse, and chaotic phenomenon. Finally, the ancient DNA samples we possess today remain limited in scope. While suggestive, the genetic data is not yet robust enough to confirm the scale of Balkan involvement in the Sea Peoples movement. Even so, the possibility remains compelling. The idea that Balkan migrations played a role, perhaps feeding into or merging with the Sea Peoples, adds a vital dimension to our understanding. It reminds us that this was not a singular invasion, but a chain reaction, a series of migrations, collapses, and desperate movements of people, all overlapping and interacting in unpredictable ways. And it is precisely this complexity that makes the story of the Sea Peoples so enduringly mysterious, so haunting, and so powerful. It is not a simple tale of conquest. It is a puzzle, one made of many moving pieces, shaped by desperation, climate disruption, political collapse, and the sheer will to survive. After decades of debate, most modern scholars now converge on what may be the most realistic conclusion. The Sea Peoples were not a unified ethnicity or a permanent alliance. They were a temporary coalition formed from many different groups, bound together by necessity during one of history's greatest systemic breakdowns. This theory is reinforced by the ancient records themselves. Egyptian inscriptions, such as the Meneptah, Stele, and the Medinet Habu reliefs, list a broad array of Sea Peoples: Shurdan, Shekelesh, Peliset, Jekka, Dinayan, and Lucca. These names suggest no single origin. Their weapons, dress, and tactics varied significantly. Some wore horned helmets, others crested or conical ones. Some used round shields, others bore unfamiliar longswords. These weren't uniform armies, they were coalitions forged in crisis. So scholars began to ask, if the Sea Peoples were a single nation, why do Egyptian records depict them with such diversity? Why do their cultural markers differ so radically from group to group? The answer is likely simple. They weren't a nation at all. In an era of cascading disasters, climate shifts, prolonged droughts, famines, earthquakes, invasions, and the collapse of palace economies. Millions were displaced. Farmers lost their land, soldiers were left without kings, pirates found new opportunities, and entire communities abandoned their homes. In this storm of collapse, a survival instinct took hold. Groups banded together. Those with ships and military experience rose to leadership. Others joined them not for conquest alone, but for shelter, food, and the promise of land. This would explain why, in every major campaign, especially those depicted in Egyptian reliefs, these migrants arrived with families, livestock, and carts full of possessions. These were not raiders seeking loot. They were people seeking resettlement, and they were willing to fight for it. Archaeology supports this interpretation. In the Levant, the cultural imprints left by the Sea Peoples vary greatly from site to site. Some display clear Aegean influences, others Anatolian, and still others show deep fusion with local Canaanite traditions. Such diversity only makes sense if the Sea Peoples were not a monolithic group, but rather a patchwork of peoples moving together in a shifting alliance. And this, perhaps, is the most powerful insight of all. The Sea Peoples were not simply destroyers. They were survivors of a world coming apart. As great cities burned and empires collapsed, they moved not because they wanted war, but because they had no choice. The world of the Bronze Age had failed them. The palace system, which once offered security, food, and order, had shattered. And in its place came a harsh new reality, one where strength alone guaranteed survival. So from 1,000 shattered lives came something newer, chaotic coalition born of necessity, driven by hope, by fear, and by the desperate instinct to endure. This is the true story of the Sea Peoples, not operates nor conquerors, but of refugees turned warriors, of migrants turned founders, and of a dying age that gave birth to a new, uncertain world. Out of a fractured world of failing kingdoms and abandoned farms, a coalition of disparate peoples began to take shape, a loose alliance, part invading force, part refugee wave. This was not a formal empire, nor a unified nation, but a fluid confederation, a temporary hybrid born of desperation and necessity. Some among them were warriors, others were displaced farmers, nomads, or unemployed mercenaries. Together, they moved as one, not because they shared a common origin, but because survival demanded unity. And like the shifting winds of the sea itself, this coalition was not fixed. It could dissolve as quickly as it formed, evolve with changing circumstances, or splinter upon reaching new shores. This explains why the Sea Peoples leave behind such a fragmented and elusive footprint in the archaeological and historical record. They were not designed to be remembered clearly. They were a movement, a wave. For this reason, many scholars now consider the idea of a temporary and adaptive alliance to be the most plausible model for understanding who the Sea Peoples really were. It also explains why, after centuries of study, no final answer has ever fully captured the scope of their mystery. Their story is less about a single people and more about the collective unraveling of a world. Of all the theories that seek to explain their rise, the most compelling is rooted not in politics or war, but in the climate itself. Because this theory does more than explain the sea. People's It sheds light on a civilization breaking apart at its very foundations. Modern climate science, using advanced methods like ice core analysis, tree ring studies, sediment layers from ancient lakes, and fossilized pollen, reveals a consistent and devastating pattern. In the late 13th and throughout the 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East experienced a prolonged and severe drought, one that may have lasted between 50 and 150 years. These drought cycles crippled rain-fed agricultural systems across vast regions. In the Levant, lakebed sediments show dramatic reductions in rainfall, directly correlating with wheat and barley production collapses. In Anatolia, tree ring records from ancient pines show repeated years of stunted growth, evidence of failed harvests. In the Aegean and Balkans, where the soil was already thin and the terrain rugged, food shortages would have turned catastrophic. These were not isolated events. This was a climate-induced breakdown on a civilizational scale. The palace economies of the Bronze Age were fragile. They relied on surplus grain, long-distance trade, and tight political control. But when the harvests failed and trade routes grew dangerous, prices surged, food disappeared, and public unrest ignited. The lower classes, peasants, laborers, and soldiers had nowhere to turn. Many abandoned their homes, setting off in search of fertile land, food, or even protection. But the world they entered was no longer stable. Most of the great powers aside were already collapsing. Kingdoms had crumbled. City walls no longer offered sanctuary. In this chaotic vacuum, migrant groups could not survive alone. The weak would be enslaved or slaughtered. The solution: band together. Form alliances capable of defending their members, fighting for resources, and if necessary, taking them by force. From this pressure cooker of desperation, the Sea Peoples were born. In this view, they were not the cause of the late Bronze Age collapse, but rather one of its most visible consequences. And yet, as they migrated, they intensified the disintegration already underway. Cities burned, trade routes vanished. Farmers were displaced. A chain reaction of collapse spiraled across the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. The destruction layers at Ugarit, Mycenae, and Pylos coincide precisely with periods of extreme drought. In the Levant, new populations appear in the archaeological record at the exact moment palace systems and international trade networks vanish. This synthesis of environmental disaster and forced migration now stands as the most convincing framework for understanding the Sea Peoples. A world built on climate stability, centralized power, and interdependence once stripped of those pillars could not endure. The Sea Peoples were not invaders in the traditional sense. They were products of collapse and, in turn, agents of its acceleration. They were not simply villains, nor merely victims. They were the human face of an age unraveling. And yet, despite all our evidence, we still face the central enigma that haunts the story of the Sea Peoples. We do not know where they came from. Across thousands of clay tablets, royal inscriptions, and monumental reliefs, not one single text provides a definitive homeland for any of these groups. There is no mention of a king of the Sheridan. No city ever declares itself the birthplace of the Paliset or the Danaan. No ancient map shows the territory of the Shekelesh or the Jakare. Why? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the surviving records, particularly those from Egypt, one of the few great civilizations that withstood the Sea People's storm. Egyptian scribes and artisans recorded their history with a specific agenda: to glorify the pharaoh, to affirm divine order, and to portray foreign enemies as lawless and stateless barbarians. Their enemies were always framed as chaotic forces, threats to the sacred order of Mat. And so, when the Egyptians spoke of the Sea Peoples, they did so in broad, vague terms. They were simply from the sea or from foreign lands. No directional markers, no clear points of origin. This may reflect not only ideological intent, but also genuine ignorance. Even the Egyptians may not have known exactly where these people came from by the time they clashed on the shores of the Nile. The sea peoples had already wandered far, their original homelands likely long abandoned or destroyed, and so we are left with a puzzle half told. A wave of collapse, a trail of ruins, and a coalition of peoples who emerge out of the storm faceless, stateless, and unforgettable. The sea peoples remain one of the great unresolved mysteries of the ancient world. Their helmets appear in stone, their ships cross reliefs, their swords are buried in ash, but their names, their homes, and their true stories, those remain lost to time. The most prominent and most thoroughly studied evidence lies in the pottery. When archaeologists unearthed layers of early Philistine settlements, they were met with an unexpected discovery: ceramics strikingly similar in form, design, and technique to those found in Mycenaean Greece. These weren't simply inspired imitations, they were, in many cases, direct continuations of the Mycenaean late Helladic IIIC style, suggesting not just cultural diffusion, but the actual transplantation of artistic traditions across the sea. Large craters, stirrup jars, and cooking vessels bore intricate geometric patterns, spiral motifs, and painted designs unmistakably foreign to the Levantine coast. But pottery was only the beginning. Beneath the ruins of Ashkelon and Ekron, entire urban layouts revealed architectural choices alien to Canaanite norms: rectangular buildings with half-centered rooms, storage silos, and columned halls echoing Aegean domestic designs. Burial customs, too, diverged from the indigenous traditions. Some early Philistine graves show the use of cremation, a practice largely foreign to Semitic Canaan, but prevalent in parts of the Aegean world. Together, these elements painted a picture not of mere cultural borrowing, but of an immigrant society actively preserving its heritage even as it adapted to a new land. Further proof came in the realm of cuisine. Traces of pig bones were unusually frequent in Philistine layers, a dietary pattern starkly different from their Israelite and Canaanite neighbors, for whom pigs were taboo. Residue analysis on ceramic vessels even revealed evidence of fermented beverages, possibly beer or spiced wines, suggesting drinking habits consistent with Western Mediterranean practices. Over time, these foreign elements blended with local customs, creating what scholars now call the Philistine cultural package, a hybrid identity forged in exile, conflict, and reinvention. Yet, even as the Philistines took root, their presence remained contentious. To the Israelites, they were the ultimate other, a rival people whose gods, language, and customs stood in sharp contrast to their own. This antagonism is immortalized in the pages of the Hebrew Bible in the story of Samson's vengeance, in the fall of Elisons, and in the towering figure of Goliath. But beyond the biblical hostility lies a more nuanced truth. The Philistines, like so many sea peoples, were not invaders driven purely by conquest. They were survivors. Their journey across the waves was born of desperation, shaped by fire and famine, and anchored in the hope of beginning anew. And so, in cities like Ashdod and Gath, their legacy endured. The Philistines not only became major political actors in the Iron Age Levante, they helped to shape the economic and military balance of the region for generations. They built city-states, minted their own coins, and maintained trade links stretching from Egypt to the Aegean. They contributed to technological innovations in ironworking, and some scholars even argue that their martial prowess prompted their neighbors to adopt more centralized forms of governance in response. In this way, the Sea Peoples were not merely a destructive wave, they were a catalyst for transformation. But while the Philistines emerged as a defined cultural identity, most other groups within the Sea Peoples simply vanished into the mosaic of ancient history. The Danaan, the Jekka, the Shakolish, and the Shurdensum may have been absorbed into existing cultures. Others may have splintered and faded without leaving a trace. Their names survive only in Egyptian inscriptions, their origins are debated, and their destinies are unknown. They came like a storm, disrupted an entire world order, and then disappeared, leaving behind only the silent ruins of cities like Ugarit and the enduring mystery of their own existence. And perhaps that is what makes the Sea Peoples so endlessly fascinating. They stand at the heart of a great collapse, neither fully cause nor fully consequence. Both victims and aggressors, remembered only through the smoke of battle and the frightened pleas of their enemies. In their story, we glimpse a broader truth about civilization itself, how fragile the structures of power can be, how swiftly prosperity can vanish, and how the displaced, the desperate, and the forgotten can reshape history in ways that even kings cannot foresee. In the charred layers of ash at Ras Shamra, in the imported pottery of Tashkelon, and in the broken cuneiform tablets never sent their lies a fragmented portrait of a world undone. But within those fragments, scattered across time and soil, is also the story of renewal. The Sea Peoples may never speak to us in their own voice, but their actions echo still in the cities they toppled, the cultures they blended with, and the myths they left behind. For as long as we dig into the earth and study the bones of forgotten empires, the Sea Peoples will remain there, haunting, ambiguous, and impossibly real, evidence for the origins and early cultural development of the Philistines comes most vividly from pottery. In the earliest Philistine occupation layers at sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza, archaeologists have uncovered a wealth of pottery that closely resembles the style of late Mycenaean IIIC ceramics. This distinctive pottery is characterized by intricate geometric pattern spirals, wavy lines, and other designs painted in red or black on a light background. These features are hallmarks of Mycenaean artistry from the twilight of the Bronze Age. Importantly, these pottery pieces found in Canaan were not imported from Greece. They were produced locally, suggesting that the artisans who brought this ceramic tradition had physically migrated and were working in their new homeland. This provides strong evidence of a real movement of people, actual migration, rather than a mere transmission of trade goods or artistic influence. Architecture adds further weight to this interpretation. At Ekron, for example, excavations have revealed buildings with open porch designs, a feature with clear parallels in late Mycenaean domestic structures. Kilns and craft workshops unearthed at these sites employed techniques strikingly similar to those used in Aegean craft centers. Funerary practices also offer compelling clues. In early Philistine cemeteries, archaeologists have found simple pit burials, sometimes accompanied by grave goods that reflect Aegean traditions. These stand in sharp contrast to the prevailing Canaanite customs of collective tombs or rock-cut chamber burials. Together, this evidence paints a vivid picture in their earliest phase. Philistine culture bore a strong Mycenaean imprint, visible in their pottery, architecture, and ritual practices. But what makes this story even more fascinating is what came next. Within just 2 or 3 generations, Philistine material culture began to evolve in significant ways. Mycenaean IIIC pottery gradually gave way to uniquely Philistine styles, with new shapes and decorative motifs that reflected a blending of influences and a surge of local innovation. Architectural forms began incorporating more Levantian features, and burial customs moved further toward regional norms. This transformation suggests that the Philistines were not simply passive bearers of Mycenaean culture. They were active participants in a process of cultural adaptation, blending, and reinvention. In response to their new environment, they forged a distinctive hybrid identity, one that honored their roots while embracing the realities of life in Canaan. Archaeologists now classify early Philistine culture, circa 1200 to 1150 BCE, as Philistine I, the phase in which the Mycenaean imprint is most visible. Later, phases Philistine II and Philistine III mark the emergence of a fully distinct Philistine identity, more localized and deeply adapted to the Levantian setting. In this way, the legacy of the so-called Sea Peoples extended beyond layers of destruction and ash. It flowed into the creation of new cultural currents, leaving lasting imprints that enriched the complex historical fabric of the Mediterranean world. And among these, the Mycenaean legacy within Philistine culture stands out as one of the clearest and most fascinating testaments to this cultural transformation. Yet, while the material traces of the Pelsit the Sea Peoples group identified, where the Philistines have come into sharper focus through archaeology, the fate of the other Sea Peoples remains far more obscure. This is not surprising. As discussed, the Sea Peoples were not a single unified ethnic group, but rather a loose alliance of disparate tribes and clans, each with its own origin, identity, and motivations. As the Great Bronze Age collapse came to an end, many of these groups, if not destroyed outright in battle, were likely absorbed into the societies where they settled. Within a few generations, their distinct names and identities would have largely faded, disappearing from the historical record. Names that once rang out from Egyptian inscriptions, Shekelesh, Jekka, Danayan, and Lukka, vanished. But this does not mean the people themselves vanished. It is far more likely that survivors of these groups gradually assimilated into local cultures, whether in the regions they had attacked or the lands where they eventually found refuge. Consider a few examples. The Shurden may have settled in the Western Mediterranean. Some scholars suggest they contributed to the development of Sardinia's warrior culture, where the massive stone towers, known as Nuraj, still stand silent monuments to a time of great upheaval. The Shekelesh, whose name bears resemblance to Sicily, may have merged into the island's indigenous communities, their unique identity fading into the broader Sicilian cultural mosaic. The Jekka left perhaps the faintest trace. At Dor, on Israel's modern coast, a layer of occupation contains cultural elements not entirely Canaanite. This may reflect a brief Jekka presence soon overtaken by dominant regional traditions. The Danayan, possibly linked to the Denaya Homeric term for Mycenaean Greeks, may have reabsorbed into the Aegean world during the post-collapse migrations and resettlements of Greece's so-called Dark Age. The Lukka associated with the Lycia region in Anatolia likely reintegrated into Anatolian highland communities, persisting under new names and identities. Thus, while the Sea Peoples as a collective force may have faded from the geopolitical stage, their legacy endured, not just in destruction, but in the transformation of Mediterranean cultures. Their echoes can still be felt in architecture, language, and traditions that bridge the worlds of the Bronze Age and the civilizations that followed. And so, as time passed and the waves of upheaval settled across the Mediterranean, the Sea People, feared and recorded by the Egyptians with such urgency, began to vanish from historical consciousness. Across each region where their presence had once been felt so profoundly, the pattern repeated itself. Fragmented groups detached from their maritime roots, gradually absorbed into the lands they had once ravaged or settled, disconnected from their sea-bound identity and lacking centralized administration. These communities had no written tradition of their own, no chronicles, no libraries, no preserved scrolls to pass their legacy to future generations. Without strong cultural institutions to maintain their memory across time, their unique identities began to dissolve. Assimilation was not immediate, but it was relentless. And so, the once distinct names, Sheridan, Shekelesh, Jekka, faded into silence, their echoes lingering only in Egyptian, stele, and the margins of later texts. What remained were faint traces, tantalizing to modern historians, but elusive, like the final ripples of a vanishing tide. Today, when we seek the legacy of the Sea Peoples, we are not merely reading ruins or sifting through layers of ash. We are deciphering the remnants of blended bloodlines and transformed cultural identities that would quietly reshape Mediterranean civilization from within. And perhaps this is why, more than 3,000 years later, their mystery endures with such intensity. The Sea Peoples were not just a military force or a destructive wave. They were a phenomenon of human transformation, a force that cannot be easily named, categorized, or mapped. A tide in history whose legacy is not carved in monuments, but woven silently into the fabric of the ancient world. And so, after tracing every shattered wall, every burned layer of, and every surviving clue in clay and stone, we begin to understand why the Sea Peoples are remembered as one of the greatest enigmas of the ancient world. Not because they left no mark. Their impact is clear in the wreckage of cities, the collapsed trade networks, and the toppled kingdoms. Nor is it due to a complete absence of records. Egyptian inscriptions, material layers from QAnon to the Levant, and even into the Aegean, all tell fragments of the tale. What makes the mystery so compelling is precisely this. The more evidence we gather, the more we recognize how little we truly understand. Every new discovery seems only to deepen the shadows. First and foremost, their origins remain cloaked in uncertainty. For over a century, scholars have attempted to trace each group: the Pelesit, often associated with the Philistines; the Sheridan, possibly linked to Sardinia; the Shekelesh, perhaps from Sicily; the Danaan, potentially tied to the Mycenaeans; the Jekka, the Lucca, and others who may have come from parts of Anatolia. Yet despite decades of research, no single theory has gained consensus. In Egyptian records, they are described simply as invaders from the sea, with no homeland named, no nonkings, and no cities to anchor their identity. They arrived not as an empire, but as a storm vast, scattered, and without a singular center. Second, and most hauntingly, the Sea Peoples left behind no written history of their own. There is no Sea Peoples chronicle, no stele engraved with their perspective, no clay tablet recounting their origin, myths, victories, or laments. Every story we have is second-hand told, through the eyes of their enemies, their survivors, and the conquerors who outlasted them. This silence is deafening. It means that their image remains half-seen, like a figure in fog, never fully clear, never fully knowable. We cannot say how they governed themselves, how they made decisions, or whether they even considered themselves a single people. Were they a confederation, a series of migrations, desperate refugees, ruthless conquerors? The lines blur. Third, their material legacy, though real, is frustratingly ephemeral. The Sea Peoples helped bring about the end of the Bronze Age. They struck major powers. The Hittite Empire fell. The Mycenaean cities were abandoned or burned. Ugarit disappeared almost overnight, and many Canaanite centers were irreversibly changed. But after the shockwaves, what remained? No grand new capital, no monumental architecture bearing their names. Their most enduring physical remnants are often the layers of destruction they left behind, cities reduced to ash, ceramic shards showing for influence, and a brief flare of Aegean-style artifacts in unexpected places. But no new empire arose. In their name, no single Sea People's civilization endured. Like a tsunami, they reshaped the shoreline, then vanished. And perhaps it is exactly this their elusiveness that keeps us captivated. We have countless stories of mighty empires, Babylon, Egypt, and Mycenae, with written languages and detailed records, but the Sea Peoples are a story of outsiders, of those who existed beyond the margins of formal history. Communities are likely desperate, displaced, or disillusioned. Communities whose own voices are forever lost, then yet who changed the course of an entire era. In their silence, they leave a space for the imagination. In their destruction, they planted new beginnings, and so their mystery will continue to haunt scholars, archaeologists, and seekers of forgotten truths. But perhaps the most profound question their story raises is not simply who were the Sea Peoples, but rather how has history chosen to remember or forget them? For were it not for the inscriptions of Egypt, their memory might have been lost altogether. It is in the temple walls of Medinet Habu, under Pharaoh Ramesses III, that we find our most vivid testimony. There etched in stone are the names Peliset, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Jekka, Danayan, and Lukka. There, in dramatic reliefs, we see horned helmets, round shields, chariots locked in battle, and behind them families migrating by sea, entire communities in motion. Women and children in ox-drawn carts or aboard ships bound for an unknown fate. This is how we remember them, not through their own words, but through the eyes of those who fought them, through ruins, through fire, through shadows cast across millennia. They are a mystery not because they never existed, but because they were never allowed to fully define themselves in history's grand ledger. And that, perhaps, is the greatest tragedy and the greatest allure of the Sea Peoples. Children, livestock, and possessions in tow entire communities moved in desperation, swept into the great upheaval that marked the end of the Bronze Age. Without the few surviving written records, the archaeological clues we now possess, the charred ruins of Ugarit, the destruction layers at Mycenae and Pylos, the sudden emergence of new settlements across Canaan might have remained unconnected fragments, silent and scattered. But those Egyptian inscriptions give us a thread to follow, and yet they also remind us of a sobering truth. History is written by the victors. It was Egypt, one of the few major civilizations to withstand the storm of the Sea Peoples, that preserved this tale, but only from its own perspective. In its stone inscriptions, the pharaoh stands as the eternal hero, the Sea Peoples cast as faceless marauders defeated by divine order. The narrative is triumphant, one-sided, and deeply political. The voices of the Sea Peoples themselves, their reasons for moving, their sufferings, their memories, are entirely absent. No scrolls, no epics, no songs carved in stone, just silence. And it is this silence that makes their story both haunting and endlessly fascinating. For what we read today is not a balanced account, it is only one half of a Mucklager human drama. We do not know what the Sea Peoples called themselves. We do not know how they saw their journey, whether as conquest or exile, desperation or destiny. And if, somewhere, there ever existed a chronicle written from their point of view. It has been long lost to time if it was ever written at all. By their very nature, the Sea Peoples were not a centralized empire. They had no enduring bureaucracies, no palatial scribes to document their decisions, and no libraries to preserve their stories. They were migrants, warriors, climatifuges, and entire cultures on the move. And in that sense, they are not only the protagonists of a forgotten war, they are emblematic of the lost voices of history. How many other peoples, how many once vital societies were swallowed by time because no one recorded their side? How many events, once thunderous in their impact, have left no echo behind? The Sea Peoples, by chance or fate, left just enough of a mark in Egyptian stone and archaeological strait that we can trace part of their path. But beyond them, surely, lie countless other migrations, destructions, and transformations erased, without a whisper. And this is what makes the mystery of the Sea Peoples so powerful. It is not only a story of them, it is a story of how history itself is made, how memory is shaped, and how whole civilizations can vanish from the record, not because they were unimportant, but because they left no voice behind. Every relief carved into temple walls, every pottery shard unearthed from ancient soil, and every surviving chronicle represents not the whole of history, but the tiny portion that happened to survive. The rest vast, sprawling, and filled with human struggles unknowable. Yet, even in their anonymity, the Sea Peoples left behind transformation. Their impact reshaped the political, economic, and cultural order of the Mediterranean. They were not just destroyers. As seen in the rise of the Philistines' descendants of the Pelesset, the Sea Peoples were also builders of new worlds. Their legacy, though obscure, shaped the destiny of nations for centuries. Still, we do not know their names. We do not know their gods, their songs, or their dreams. They remain, like so many others in our past, shadows on the walls of Timor Wave, from the deep past whose echoes continue to haunt the present. And so, as we reach the closing lines of their story, we are left with one profound question. If Egypt had not inscribed their existence into stone, would we even know they existed? How many other chapters of the human journey, entire civilizations, lifetimes, epics, have been lost without a single trace? How many are waiting to be rediscovered beneath layers of earth, in forgotten ruins, in broken relics, buried under centuries of silence? This is why the study of history never truly ends. For history is not only what we know, it is also what we have forgotten, what was never recorded, and what was erased. And in every unanswered question, in every lost voice, there is a reason to keep searching. Perhaps one day, somewhere in an untouched field or a sealed cave, a new clue will surface, one that will change everything we thought we knew. Until then, our only way forward is to keep asking, to keep exploring, and to never let the silence have the final word. And if you, like us, believe that history still holds countless untold stories, you believe that we must continue to seek the forgotten and question what we think we know, then subscribe to this channel. Join us on the journey ahead, where every episode is another step into the unknown, another door into the past. Because this journey, like the vast and hidden history of humankind, will never truly come to an end.